Welcome to the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society's annual Ben Karp Memorial Lecture, when Adele Sidney will be speaking about her family, the Goldstein family, on Monday, June the 11th, 2007.
Thank you, John. Can everybody hear me? Since I haven't got much of a voice anymore. It's a pleasure for me to introduce Adele. I think it's kind of funny. I don't really have to do too much. I think Elaine did a good job with the little summary in the newsletter that everybody got. When Adele and I, both born and raised in Ottawa, but it wasn't Adele I knew when I was young, it was Eileen. And we used to stand on the corner of Alta Vista and Heron Road and talk to each other before we went separate ways. And that was pretty typical in those days. Adele, as you know, went to Carleton. She was really lucky and spent a year at the Hebrew University. She did a degree at Carleton in economics and political science, and another degree she got a BCom, all stuff that's beyond me. So she's been very active in many Jewish organizations. We belong to the same Hadassah chapter. So the paths separate and the paths cross, right? She's married to Dr. Jeff Sidney, and they have 2 children, and you have a married daughter in Israel, right? And Lakewood, sorry. And I think as someone who's I'm hoping one of these days to be a grandparent, so I assume you are too. Anyway, I'm sure we're all going to enjoy listening to you talk. So without further ado, Adele.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you all for coming this evening. My name, as you heard, is Adele Sidney, and I'm the daughter of the late Louis and Miriam Goldstein and the granddaughter of the late Bella Gluck Goldstein. This is the story of my bubby, Bella Gluck Goldstein, and her descendants and their impact on the Jewish community in Ottawa. In May of 1907, exactly 100 years ago, Bella Gluck married Moshe Goldstein in Hungary. Moshe had 5 sisters who left for the States shortly after the turn of the century. The Goldsteins had some amount of property that his sisters all signed over to Moshe, and so he chose to stay in Europe to look after the family property and run a krechma, or tavern. Bella was almost 24 years old when she married. She was the eldest of 5 siblings, 3 boys and 2 girls. Bella's father, David Gluck, was also a krechmarish. All but one of Bella's siblings were still in Europe, and so she was also not interested in going to America. Bella and Moshe lived in Ungvar, Hungary, where they eked out a living running their krechma. Their first 6 children were born in Ungvar from 1908 to 1917, while the last 2 were born in 1919 and 1921 in Uzhhorod, Czechoslovakia. Same city, new border and name. The photo that you see is the only one that we have of the entire family together. The woman on the right with the young boy leaning on her is actually Moshe's sister and her son, who had come from New York to Europe to visit. And that was the occasion for a photo. Bella and Moshe's children's life in Europe was an interesting mix of Jewish observance and ardent Zionism. The Czechoslovakia of 1918 to 1938, during their youth, was a free and democratic society. Jews made up about 1/4 of the Uzhhorod population and practiced their Judaism openly and proudly. Zionist aspirations were freely and publicly expressed. The family was Shomer Shabbat and Shomer Mitzvahs. The boys wore peyot and had a solid Jewish education, which they spoke of as somewhat less than pampered or pleasant. Moshe Goldstein was described as a Zionist, while the children were active either in Hashomer HaTzair, which Bella was not so fond of, or Mizrahi. We're talking the 1920s and 1930s here. The family considered them middle class, as they were better off than many of their neighbors. What was middle class life like? Friday's dinner was a single chicken for the 10 family members, with Louis, my father and the youngest, getting the pupuk and the feet, and Bella being satisfied with the head. The 3 youngest boys shared a single bed in the hallway, but they had wooden floors, not dirt, and there was running water piped in by the city, albeit to a tap down the block. During the 1920s, Bella's brother Sam came from Canada to visit his sister, saw her difficult life, and tried to convince her that joining him and his family in a city called Ottawa would be a better choice. Bella's brother was Samuel Gluck of Ottawa, who was already a successful businessman, having left his parents' home in Europe many years earlier as a teenager. The fascinating story of the Gluck family and the Premier hat shops is one that I will leave to his son, my cousin Manny Gluck, to tell. At Samuel Gluck's urging, from 1927 to 1939, Bella Gluck Goldstein and her 8 children would all gradually arrive in Ottawa. Bella herself would never leave Ottawa. Her children and grandchildren would come and go over the years, but Ottawa would remain the focal point for the Goldstein family. The first to arrive was the oldest, Rose, who came to Uncle Sam Gluck's home at 11 Clemo in January of 1927 at age 18. This was a pattern that all the others would follow, arriving in Ottawa and being hosted at Uncle's beautiful home before they moved on to establish their own lives. The contrast with their life in Europe was dramatic, and the Greenhorns couldn't even speak to their Canadian cousins. That house, by the way, is now 15 Clemo. Same house, new name. Is there a pattern here? Rose's younger brother, also named Sam, arrived at the end of 1927. He was only 15, but it was important to leave before the Army restricted your travel abroad. Rose soon left Uncle's home to seek her fortune with the aunties, her father's 5 sisters, who, as I said, had already settled in New York. Sam, however, remained in Ottawa, apprenticing with Abe Schwartz as an electrician. In 1929, after just 2 years in the trade and barely 17 years old, Sam began the electrical firm that would become the well-known Goldstein Brothers Electrical Contractors. Back in Užhorod, Moshe Goldstein died of lung problems in 1931 at the age of 48, leaving Bella a widow with 6 children still at home and a krechma to run in the midst of the Depression. This photo shows Bella, this photo did show Bella in front. The woman to her left, further right, is her sister Jofi, who was her only sister and who was murdered in the Holocaust. The 6 children that were remaining when her husband died are around her. By 1933, Sam Goldstein had saved enough money to sponsor the next brother, Herschel, better known later as Harry, to come to Ottawa at that magic age of 15. This was not a simple matter, as immigration was tight and a special order in council was needed, facilitated, so the story goes, by Uncle's brother-in-law, Bob Edelstein, who had close ties with various MPs. Harry and Sam lived with a Mrs. Goldsmith on Clarence Street, and Harry went to school for a time and then worked with Sam in the electrical trade. In 1936, immigration rules had changed somewhat, and the youngest brothers, Leo, age 16, and my father, Louis, age 15, and their older sister, Shari, age 22, all arrived in Ottawa. Again, the boys went to school for a time, and then Louis joined his brother Sam in the business, while Leo divided his time between Ottawa and Montreal, where he was active in Hashomer Hatzair. Although Shari's wedding was held at the Gluck home in Ottawa, she settled in Montreal to raise her family. Harry, in the meantime, had left Ottawa to go up north to seek his fortune. In 1937, Rose returned from New York to Ottawa with her husband, Harry Rappaport, and their son, Morton. In that year, 1937, the Ottawa Goldsteins and Rappaports, 6 or 7 people, shared a 1-bedroom apartment at Rideau and Nelson. In 1939, in the shadow of the war, Bella Gluck Goldstein arrived in Ottawa at age 56 with her 2 remaining children, Rella, age 23, and Henry, the oldest son, then 29. One of the many stories goes that Henry was so involved as a senior leader in Hashomer Hatzair in Czechoslovakia that he was not interested in coming to Canada at all. The family recalled that when the Canadian immigration officer came to the house in Ottawa in 1939 to fill out the papers to bring Bella and her daughter Rella, she asked if the Goldsteins had any other relatives still in Europe. They replied yes, a brother, Henry. She said that they had better put him on the papers too, as this might be his last chance to get out. When the papers arrived in Užhorod, Henry reluctantly joined his mother and sister in leaving for fear that without him, the papers would be questioned because his name was on them. That was June of 1939, and how very right that immigration officer was. Everyone was now safe. 7 family members had managed to enter Canada legally from 1933 to 1939 at a time when European Jews were desperately trying to leave and Canada kept the doors largely shut from them. Once they arrived in Canada, the reality of life was quite apparent. As so many immigrants discovered, life in the New World, especially during the Depression, meant focusing on making a living with little room left for much else. Nonetheless, the hard work and long hours did not diminish their involvement in Jewish life in many other ways. Shuls were a focus of Goldstein involvement in Ottawa. In the early years, Bella and the children who lived with her on Nepean Street attended James Street Shul. Later on, when Bella was living alone, the oldest grandson, Morton Rappaport, had the task of walking Bubby home each week. Presumably, she was able to get there on her own. His reward was fresh-baked kuchen to fortify him for the walk back to Monk Street in the Glebe. Most of the Goldsteins started off their married lives at either Machziki Adas on Murray Street or Adat Yeshurun on King Edward Avenue, the King Street Shul that eventually became the funeral chapel. Franklin, Sam's son, had the last bar mitzvah at Adat Yeshurun in 1956 before it moved to what is now Beth Shalom. My parents, Louis and Miriam, were active at James Street Shul once they moved to Apollodore Avenue in Ottawa South. They headed the Men's Club and Sisterhood, respectively. Louis always regretted the closing of James Street Shul, as he felt having a center-town shul gave the many Jewish businessmen a place to form a minyan for Kaddish or Yortzites. Mo Litvak recalls when the members met to discuss the closing of James Street Shul that Louis' son, my brother Sidney Goldstein, just in his late teens at the time, addressed the crowd with great emotion, arguing for keeping the shul open. Those, of course, were the days when even my non-Jewish classmates knew better than to go shopping on a Jewish holiday, because all the Jewish stores, and there were many, were closed, including Goldstein Brothers. Few businesses are so visibly Jewish today. When the Ottawa Torah Institute opened in Ottawa South, Norman Tenenbaum recalls that Louis was often called upon to help with the minyan, as he lived just a few blocks away. His brother-in-law, Gus Solomon, was also a regular at minyan. The best-known shul involvement was undoubtedly Harry's presence at the West End Shul, Agudath Israel. Harry was a regular shul attendee, and although he sat near the back, he sang with great enthusiasm, dubbing himself the Chazan Shlishi of the congregation. Rabbi Fine remembers a warm relationship with Harry, generally punctuated by challenging questions. Harry was intellectually probing and would accept no easy answers from Rabbi Fine's discussions. Harry disagreed often with the rabbi, but always with love and respect. Between 1934 and 1948, all of Bella's children married. Many of the Goldstein marriages created Ottawa bonds. In July 1939, Sarah married the vivacious Miriam London, who counted the Ottawa Freemans among her cousins. Miriam's brother, Dave London, and Sam's brother, Louis, moved in with Miriam and Sam after their marriage. Things weren't exactly luxurious, as Louis and Dave both slept on the Chesterfield. Leo married Malka Jacobson in July of 1942. Their Ottawa connections included the marriage of Malka's sister Bertha to Gordie Murray. Malka's mother, Mrs. Jacobson, lived with them for many of the years they spent in Ottawa. In October 1944, my father, Louis, married Mom, a local Ottawa girl by the name of Miriam Dubrow. In the post-war years, they would live with Miriam's sister and family, Esther and Gus Salmon, on Percy Street, until after Eileen and Sidney were born. Later, they lived on York Street, where I was born, and then on Apollodore Avenue for many years, always with Miriam's mother, Fanny Dubrow. Harry married Malka Sloan in October 1945. She was the daughter of Bessie and Nathan Sloan, again a large and established Ottawa family. Henry, Bella's oldest son, had perhaps the most interesting story. After the war, he began a correspondence with a woman from near his hometown of Uzhhorod. He soon wooed Yolanda Simkovich and sponsored her to come to Canada, where they were married in Ottawa in May 1948. Yolanda's status in Canada enabled her to sponsor her sister and brother-in-law, Lenka and Bill Grossman, as well as her brother and his wife. Her sister-in-law in turn sponsored her brother, Dave Moskovich. Mr. Moskovich tells me that he lived in Bella Goldstein's home for some time after he arrived in Ottawa, and it was Harry Goldstein who took him around to find work in his profession as a plumber. Henry and Yoli parted amicably enough a few years later after moving to New York. Both remarried. Henry never had children and never returned to Ottawa. The Goldstein family operated several well-known businesses in Ottawa. The oldest was the electrical contracting business. In the early years, Sam operated the business out of his home, but eventually the neighbors on Stewart Street complained, and Sam moved the supplies to cramped quarters behind Mrs. Pike's Ye Old Bookshop, near Bank and Nepean, where Uncle Sam Gluck had his premier hat shop. The Glucks weren't the only relatives in Ottawa. Bella's first cousin, Frida Friedman, also came to live in Ottawa with her husband Gus and their son Alfie. They, like the Glucks, were in the hat business. They ran Astor Chapeau. In 1950, the property at Bank and Nepean became the home of Goldstein Brothers Electrical Contractors, with Sam, Harry, Louis, and Israel Shalom all in the business. The new storefront at 205 Bank included retail sales of appliances and electronics. Louis was on service, Harry looked after the bigger jobs, Sam was mostly the PR man, and Israel Shalom ran the store. Israel Shalom was a cousin of Harry's wife Malka, and was known by most people simply as Shalom. This led many people to assume that he was another of the brothers, Shalom Goldstein. I recall that the three Shalom children, Judy, Susie, and Jim, who are all now living in Israel, were included in Goldstein family gatherings just like any other cousins. There was a series of salesmen over the years who seemed to conduct most of their business at the various bars on Bank Street, often diplomatic personnel who added bottles of cheap liquor to the payments to seal the deal. Alec Weiss worked at Goldstein Brothers for many years. Joe Murray tells me that Alec was known as Sam the Hungarian for reasons that no one knows now. Annie Brzozowski recalls two Goldstein stories. First, her husband Sam Brzozowski apprenticed with Sam Goldstein in the mid-1940s. Years earlier, Annie recalls, her mother, Mrs. Kardish, went out and bought a new stove for their house on York Street. Sam Goldstein was called to install it, but he took one look at the flimsy stove and refused. Sam knew the Kardish family and he knew stoves. He said something to the effect of, "This stove is not for you, I won't connect it." He then advised Mrs. Kardish where to shop and what type of strong, solid stove to buy for her family needs. There are lots of stories. Norman Tenenbaum described Sam as a compassionate man who never turned anyone down for service, even if they couldn't pay. In fact, the late Penny Kardish recalled that Sam went into a particularly poor home to do a repair, and when the woman asked what she owed, he announced that he would send her a bill. That was never sent, of course. Louis used to say that on Friday, Sam always carefully paid any men he had working for him, then had to ask them to loan him back some money so he could support his own family. Apparently, Sam's compassionate approach rubbed off on younger brother Louis, because Norman Tenenbaum also recalls Louis telling people who couldn't afford the cost of a repair call, "Don't go through the shop," and he would go in the evenings on his own time to do the work. Many was the meal that Louis went to where the hostess would just happened to have a lamp or switch or something that wasn't working, and could Louis just have a look at it? He always traveled with tools in the car in anticipation of these requests. Repair work brought Louis right into people's homes, where he saw the best and worst of life. Much of it moved him to tears. He recalled in the early years going to a home so poor that the mother was tearing apart her summer kitchen for wood to heat the house. The next generation of that family became quite wealthy. Louis's repair work also meant long days and weekend emergency calls. My mom, Miriam, would often answer the phone late at night or on a Sunday and instruct the caller to be sure to check all the fuses and bulbs and connections, things she herself had no idea how to do, and then sternly advise them that after-hours emergencies cost double time, something that Goldsteins never charged, all in an effort to save Louis from having to go out again. Sam, the brother who founded the electrical business, was a big man with an equally big heart, but his approach to business drove his younger and more business-savvy brother, Harry, crazy. Indeed, it was mostly under Harry's guidance that the business grew and became successful. After Sam's death in 1960, Harry, Louis, and Israel Shalom expanded the business in the big building years of the 60s and early 70s. Sam's second son, Frank, started working with Goldstein Brothers in 1964 and got his journeyman's license in 1968. He worked with his Uncle Louis for many years on the service truck and describes Louis as his mentor during that time. Frank remembers payrolls for 25 to 30 people and says many of the 10 and 12-story high-rises that were built in the 70s were wired by Goldsteins. A fire totally destroyed the Bank and Nepean store in 1967, and the business moved to a location at Bank and Gilmore. The final retail move was to Dalhousie Street, next to Desjardins Drugstore. When Harry left the business, Louis took over with partners Joe Sell and Shmuel Feig. When Louis himself retired in 1974, after over 30 years, there was a period without Goldsteins and Goldstein Brothers, until Franklin returned from Israel in 2001 to buy back the business his father had started over 70 years earlier. Most of the nephews worked at Goldstein Brothers for a summer at least. They were helpers, gophers that is, and the electricians were fond of having fun at their expense. Being related to the boss certainly didn't stop you from being sent off to get a sky hook or a bucket of steam, much to the amusement of the tradesmen. Harry's financial ambitions were not satisfied by the electrical business, so he later partnered with Moshe Feig to establish Eiffel Construction, a successful construction firm. Their largest project was the Alta Vista Towers, built in 1969 or 70. Eiffel took on projects and Goldsteins wired them. In 1939, prior to rejoining his brother Sam as an electrician, Harry returned to Ottawa from a period of working up north and with Uncle's help went into the restaurant business. After a year, Sam asked Harry to rejoin him in the electrical trade, so Harry turned the restaurant over to his sister Rose and her husband Harry Rappaport. The Rappaports ran that restaurant, the Mirror Grill, on Bank Street in the Glebe, from 1940 until 1953, when the family left Ottawa for California. The war years were a boon for the restaurant, as it was located near Lansdowne Park, where the numerous military parades terminated, and up the street from both the Women's Army Corps Barracks and Glebe and Commerce High Schools. There was a movie theater in the Glebe, too, the Avalon, that provided evening clientele. Young Morton Rappaport showed early entrepreneurial talent by parking cars on their Monk Street property each year during the X. Rose and Harry were good friends with the Gerstow family, including their daughter, the late Greta Cohen. Rose's son, Morton, and Greta's son, Ben Carniol, were best of friends. Even many years later, I recall Mrs. Cohen speaking of Rose. One other Goldstein business is known to many here. From 1954 until the departure for Israel in 1970, Leo and his wife Malka operated Leo's Confectionery, first at corner Wilbrod and Friel, and later corner Kirkwood and Clare. Thus, during the war years, Rose and her husband, Harry Rappaport, ran the Mirror Grill. Henry had a small shop where he sold confections and repaired women's silk stockings. Sam was building the electrical business with Harry. Sherry and Rella lived and worked in Montreal. Leo spent time in Montreal and Ottawa and served in the Canadian Army from 1942 to 1944. Louis worked with Sam and Harry before volunteering for the RCAF and serving from 1942 to 1945. The 1950s were years of movement for many of the Goldsteins. In 1953, Rose Rappaport and her family left Ottawa for the last time to move to Los Angeles. She had raised her children, Morton, age 17, and Judy, age 10, in Ottawa, and they would always retain clear and fond memories of the city and their family here. They returned every few years to visit with a movie camera, a wonder in those days. And the 6 or so hours of home movies of those visits has, happily, been reduced by film editor Rochelle Goldstein Bergman to a nostalgia-filled 60-minute video that you can all watch a bit later in the other room. After the war, in 1946, Leo and his wife Malka had gone to Palestine, where they had 2 children, Moshe and Esther. In June 1954, the family returned to Ottawa, where a 3rd child, youngest son Norman, was born in 1958. Also in 1958, Rella, husband Fred Major, and their sons Murray and Stanley came to Ottawa from New York to set up house on Sweetland Avenue and take in Rella's aging mother, Bella. Rella was active in Hillel Academy, where Murray and Stanley were students. She was a lunchroom helper for much of the late 50s and early 60s. Sam and Miriam's home at 300 Wilbrod is fondly remembered as a focal point for family gatherings, formal or informal. Things always seemed to happen at their house. There was the Russian tenant by the name of Popov, who informed Sam and Miriam that he had to go back to Russia urgently and disappeared overnight. The next day, the story broke in the newspapers that he was a Russian spy. Miriam was interviewed by the press, and she kept saying that she was sorry he was gone because at least he always paid the rent on time. Her son Frank recalls that as a young lad, he walked the dog of Prime Minister Mackenzie King from Laurier House. Louis and Sam built a small apartment next to 300 Wilbrod, and John Diefenbaker was not only a tenant there, but a regular customer at Brother Leo's confectionery at the corner. Even in later years, the adventures on Wilbrod Street continued. In the days of young artists at Louis Boo on Sussex Drive, Sam's daughter Rochelle brought home a folk singer one night after the show for coffee. As I recall the story, Miriam woke up, was less than amused, and basically showed the fellow the door. That fellow was Gord Lightfoot. Sam's Miriam was a widow for many years after his death, but just as she had welcomed and nurtured Sam's mother and siblings in her home in the earlier years, so was she treated as more of a sister than a sister-in-law in the years after his death. In fact, Miriam would remarry years later to Marie Rosenfeld of New York, who was a cousin to the Goldsteins on their father's side. Marie and Louis became close friends during the 6 years Marie lived in Ottawa, and Louis referred to him as my cousin brother-in-law, another indication of how close he felt to Miriam. By the late 50s, Bella had 5 of her children and 15 of her grandchildren living near her in Ottawa. It was the largest number of Goldstein blood relatives that would ever live in the city. The 60s saw most of Bella's Ottawa grandchildren move through their teens and into adulthood. 1960 was a dramatic year for the Goldsteins. Bella's son Sam, who had been suffering with throat cancer for many years, was very ill. Bella said she could not bear to live to see a child of hers die. So it was that in April of 1960, Bella passed away. Sam died a few months later in August, just days shy of the age his father died, 48. 1965 was another sad year for the Goldstein family. Harry's daughter Susan took sick and passed away in March at just 14 years of age. In August, Rella succumbed to cancer at age 49. Rella's sons, Murray and Stanley Major, went to live with their Uncle Harry and his wife Malka, and a year later, Murray moved to his Uncle Louis and Aunt Miriam's house. There are many happy times to remember, too. In the early years, Rose's family, the Rappaports, rented a summer cottage at Delta, Ontario. Later, Sam, Harry, Israel Shalom, and the Harry Agulniks bought adjacent lots on the shore of Lac Bernard in Quebec and built cottages there. For many years, the wives and kids would move out to the cottages for the summer, and the men would come out for the weekends. The connections forged over those summers ran deep. Frank and his wife Elaine were the ones to introduce Manny of Golding to his wife Paula. Harry's son Mark wanted to retire to that location that held such fond memories for him. He couldn't get the old cottages, but he does have a beautiful home just across the lake. There was fun in the city, too. Brighton Beach on the Rideau River in Ottawa South was a favorite gathering place for the Jewish community, including the Goldstein clan. It was a private beach with a large grassy area and booms and rafts in the river. In the video that you can see later, it shows the crowd at Brighton Beach. There was also a beach on the Mississippi River near Ottawa that was a favorite recreation site for many Jewish families from the city. In the days before cell phones and beepers, the surest way to avoid having an emergency call was to not be at home. Therefore, my father Louis's desire to have a break from work led to many pleasant family day trips on a Sunday. In the early days, before we had a car, a Sunday excursion first involved clearing out the truck to make room for kids. The St. Lawrence Seaway, then under construction, was a favorite destination, including the soon-to-be-moved town of Iroquois, whose site was flooded for the Seaway. The family gathering places were Sam and Miriam's house on Wilbrod, especially for parties or if anyone was in town visiting, Leo's confectionery, where nieces and nephews could have a cold Coke and peruse the comics under the no reading sign. The house on the St. Lawrence, outside of Brockville, where Sam Gluck's widow Lydia would happily host carloads of Goldsteins out for a summer ride. Sherry's home in Montreal, which was another favorite family destination on a summer Sunday. One theme that I found cropped up again and again in discussions with Goldsteins is Kuchen. For those of you who may not know, Kuchen is a yeast dough roll loaf, most often filled with chocolate, but sometimes with cinnamon. Bubby Goldstein was, as I've already said, renowned for her Kuchen. Auntie Rose was a pretty mean Kuchen baker herself, but there is some debate how hers stacked up to her mother's. Auntie Rella was also a Kuchen baker, or at least my sister Eileen remembers being served Kuchen at her house. Perhaps it was really Bubby's. Auntie Sherry in Montreal made Melba Thin Mundelbräut, but I can't recall any Sherry Kuchen. There was, however, a kosher bakery in Montreal on Victoria near Van Horn that baked a fair Kuchen. On Sunday visits, we would drop by and the owners would start bringing down however many loaves of Kuchen they had. We generally bought them out and distributed the bounty to the various Goldstein households when we got back to Ottawa. Uncle Harry enjoyed baking, but even his son Mark feels that his father's Kuchen simply didn't match up to Bubby's. However, that was not Harry's opinion. I believe there is Kuchen available at the dessert table to sample. Baking Kuchen wasn't Harry's only domestic hobby. He made a good challah and tended an extensive garden in the backyard that included fruit trees, a vineyard, and many rows of vegetables. Much of the grape harvest went into a contraption in the basement with tanks and burners and curly tubes, but I was happily spared from having to sample the result. The Goldstein family engaged in many charitable and Zionist activities. Over the years, especially after the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, the Goldsteins would help out newly arrived Hungarian immigrants. Because they had a business and spoke the language, they often took on newcomers as truck drivers or helpers at Goldstein Brothers to give them a livelihood until they learned English and struck out on their own. In her own historical talk on the Fag family, Sarah Briner recounted how her father, Shmuel Fag, began as an electrician in Canada with Goldstein Brothers, despite his lack of English. He would go out to jobs in homes with a sign that read, "I'm the electrician, let me in." Later, of course, Shmuel Fag would become one of the partners in the firm. Within the family circle, there was a family fund to which everyone contributed as they were able, and this was used to help either the extended family overseas or the siblings here when need arose. Louis and Harry established a number of Ottawa Jewish Community Foundation funds over a period of 30 years or more, some in their own names and some to memorialize other family members. As tough as he was in business, Harry was a very soft touch when it came to Jewish causes, but he seldom sought the spotlight, and much of what he gave and did was largely unknown. After Minyan, Rabbi Fine would often approach Harry with a cause or a hardship story and ask for some financial aid on someone's behalf. Harry's response was always generous, and his attitude to the rabbi was, "I trust you, I don't want to know the details, how much?" An anonymous source told me that Harry once signed for a loan for him, on which the source unfortunately defaulted. He said that Harry continued to always treat him with friendship and respect and never spoke to him about the loss. Harry was also very generous with his extended family, but tended to live a Spartan existence when it came to himself. His wife Malka once told me that Harry was visiting his sister Rose in L.A. and went out to buy and install an air conditioner for her. When he came back, he told Malka, "Can you imagine, Rose didn't even have an air conditioner?" To which Malka replied, "Harry, we don't have an air conditioner." Sam, Harry, Louis, and Leo were all active in the labor Zionist movement in Ottawa for many decades. I always found it strange that the Ottawa labor Zionist movement was dominated by businessmen and entrepreneurs, but then most had begun their Zionist affiliation in Europe. State of Israel Bonds was another campaign with much Goldstein involvement. The Habonim Zionist Youth Group was heavily supported and nurtured particularly by Harry, who was for years a driving force behind Camp Gesher, into which he poured many hours of labor, much money, and enormous enthusiasm. All the Goldsteins visited Israel, most of them many times. Leo and Malka spent many years living in Palestine and then Israel. In Ottawa, Sam's son Frank and Leo's son Moshe were leaders in Young Judea. Sam's daughter Rochelle was Rosh Ken, or head of Habonim. I was mentored in Young Judea by Leo's daughter Esther, who I recall leading the group with Minda Rudy Wershoff. After that, I took on a leadership role in Young Judea in an era when we partnered extensively with Habonim. Most of Bella's grandchildren went to Israel for extended periods to live or study, and family trips are common. 2 of my generation and some number of our children now make their permanent homes in Israel. All of my cousins left Ottawa at some point, either temporarily or permanently, to study or work, but many of them and their children have returned to the home base in Ottawa. Sam's older son Morris married Shirley Halpern here in Ottawa, and their son, named Sammy after his grandfather, became an amateur playwright in Ottawa before becoming a lawyer in Toronto. Sam's other son, Frank, married Elaine Perlman, daughter of Dr. Lyon and Naomi Perlman. As I mentioned earlier, Frank and Elaine spent over 20 years in Israel, returning in 2001 to reestablish the Goldstein and Goldstein brothers. Frank's son, one of his daughters, and both of his grandchildren live here in Ottawa. Sam's daughters, Rochelle and Jessica, grew up in Sandy Hill, went to Carleton for their first degrees, and then left the city. They have both lived their adult lives with their families in Toronto. Louis's children, my siblings, and I were also raised in Ottawa. My sister Eileen went to Ridgemont and Teachers College and then left for life in Toronto. My brother, Sidney Goldstein, left Ottawa for law school. Later, he and his wife, Ottawan Geraldine Sape, returned to Ottawa, where they raised their 2 children, Audrey and Michael, and established and operated the law practice of Goldstein and Goldstein, barristers and solicitors, for many years. That partnership has now been dissolved, and Sid spends much of his time between his home in Toronto and his children and grandchildren who are in Israel, but still maintains a home here in Ottawa. Sid's son Michael is also here in Ottawa studying and working. Except for 1 year studying in Jerusalem, I never left Ottawa. I worked in the government with various Zionist shul and other mostly Jewish causes. I married my husband Jeff in 1980 and raised our 2 children here. My son David works at the SJCC with Jewish Education Through Torah. My daughter Rochel lives with her husband in Lakewood, New Jersey. Rella's children, the major boys, were active in AZA, with first Murray and then Stanley filling the role of Aleph Gadol of Region Chapter. While both boys left Ottawa early on, Murray's daughter Rhonda did come to Ottawa for a time to work and study at Carleton University. Harry's son, Mark, spent many years in California before returning to Ottawa with his wife, Debbie, and their children to go into business and look after some of his father's affairs. He has a home in Lac Bernard, where the family had cottages years ago, where he lives in retirement when he's not traveling. Mark's 4 children, Bethany, Nathan, Ilana, and Shari, and his 2 grandchildren all live here in the city. Bethany teaches at Hillel Academy, and Shari is that cheerful face at the desk of the SJCC. Harry's daughter Sharon left Ottawa for Israel, then lived in California, and finally made Aliyah with her husband, where she now lives in Haifa. Leo, his wife Malka, and all 3 of their children left Ottawa in 1970 for Israel. Moshe, the oldest son, still lives in Rehovot. After many years in Israel and then in Guelph, Ontario, Esther has returned to Ottawa to pursue her career as an OT administrator with the Ottawa Hospital. Norman and his wife Debbie recently returned to Ottawa, and he's working with OC Transgo. Their mother Malka, the last remaining Goldstein of that generation, is at Hillel Lodge. There are 18 direct descendants of Bella Gluck Goldstein now living in the Ottawa area, more than at any time since the late 1950s. Thank you all once again for coming this evening. If there are any questions, I'll try to answer them.
I'd now like to call upon Stuart Lazier to thank our speaker for tonight.
I guess I should speak into this. Adele, thank you very much for the presentation. Earlier this week, there was the Ottawa premiere of a film on the Rideau Bakery, which a lot of people have seen. But I think the sequel to that will be Cookin' with Cookin' with the Goldstein family. I enjoyed your talk very much, particularly the inspiring beginnings of Goldstein Brothers. I think that was started by somebody who was under 20. You know, the chutzpah, was he 19 or 17 to do that, to start something like a business that would be a legacy for the family and for Ottawa for many decades is amazing. 17. The intro started with a connection to your family. My connection was with Susan. I was a classmate of hers at Hillel Academy in the 60s, and I remember her as though it were yesterday. Thank you very much for your inspiring talk, and here's a token of the Historical Society.
Adele. Okay, that ends our program for tonight. There are refreshments at the back of the room, and hopefully we will see you again in the fall when we, at the moment, have 2 different speakers, one for September and one for October. So hopefully we'll see you again. Thank you very much. What do you do? How do you stop?
I'll stop it.